Hi there, my name is Holly Sater, and I want to show you this fun shaker card with the new idea I came up with for an interactive element. I've had this idea for about a year now, and I finally gave it a go. It worked just like I had hoped. I used clear jewelry thread strung across the card with the bead threaded on. Then I could just take my stamped and colored image, adhere it to the bead, and it'll move back and forth across the string. For this card, I'll be using this Tiddly Ink stamp set. I love these dogs with balloons, and they would be perfect for this technique. When I'm stamping images, I always find it's helpful to stamp a few extras. If the coloring doesn't go quite like you wanted to, you can always move on to the next one. Or if they all turn out great, then you can always use them on future cards. I'm using Memento Tuxedo Black ink because I'll be coloring with Copics. You do have to keep in mind that whenever you use Copics, you do need to use a Copic friendly ink. One thing that I've only recently started doing is, especially with Memento Tuxedo Black, it doesn't always stamp very crisp. So one thing I like to do is stamp the image and hold it on for a few seconds. I used to try to mash it down really hard for just 1 or 2 seconds, but I've gotten a much crisper image every time this way. Especially when coloring a lot of images, I like to use this quick techniques with my Copics. I just take the lightest gray marker that I have, which is the C1, and pull the color from outside the lines onto the dog image. This allows me to saturate the paper less than I normally would when I use my Copics, but it gives me a lighter shade. So I'll just go in and just very, very quickly put some color on, and I don't have to worry about staying inside the lines because I know I'll be cutting these out later. Next, I'll go in with my C3 marker and I'll just add some shading in certain areas, and I'm not getting too worked up over where the lighting is or anything. I just want to add some texture and depth. Once I've got down my gray colors, then I can go back in with my colorless blender and buff out any areas that have harsh lines. Also, I can use this to lighten up any areas that got darker than what I wanted. For Copic coloring, I like to use Recollections 110-pound cardstock for Michaels. Now, I know that many people like to use the Nina Solar white 110-pound cardstock, but I have been extremely happy with this Recollections paper. Sometimes people experience issues with bleeding outside of the lines whenever they're using these Copics, but this paper works very, very well for me. You do need to keep in mind what type of paper you want to use whenever you're using Copics, because you have to use something pretty substantial to hold all the ink that saturates into the paper. This particular brand is only about $8 with a coupon, so this is my paper of choice for any time I need white paper from stamping and coloring images, and I use it exclusively on all my card bases. I really like how substantial it is. It's really thick, which to me just screams quality. Usually I feel like you have to order online to get nice quality paper, but this is just from Michaels, and I think it's really great. Next, I'm moving on to the balloons. Now, you could do lots of fun things here. I find that this is great to experiment with your Copics. If you have a few colors of each color family, you can see what works for shading and what doesn't. Another thing you could do is add highlights to these balloons using either a gel pen, or you could use your colorless blender to kind of take some of that color off and add a highlight on the balloons. Another thing I've done with these balloons in the past is I looked through my stamps that I had and picked out some small ones. I took my white pigment ink and used my small stamps to stamp designs on top of the balloons. You can stamp it right on top of the Copics. So I have dots, flowers, hearts, you could do swirls, whatever small stamps you have on hand. And finally, another thing you can do for balloons especially, you can use glossy accents. It's a liquid adhesive that you can put right over items to make it look clear, almost like glass right on top of it. That's really a neat effect for balloons. So here I'm just doing some easy Copic coloring. I'm using about 3 markers per balloon. I'm using the lightest towards the top of the balloon, the mid-tone in the middle, and the darkest towards the bottom. I'm just trying to get a nice blend. Again, I know I'll be cutting these balloons out, so if they bleed out of the lines a little bit, that's okay. And whenever I color the bottom of the balloon where you blow the air in, I don't have to worry about staying within those lines. I know I've spent a lot of time focusing on Copic coloring in this video, but you could use whatever coloring medium you have. Now, I will be separating out these balloons from the dogs in the next step, so I don't necessarily have to keep the balloons with the dog they're attached to, which is good to keep in mind if you make any coloring mistakes but want to still keep the already colored image of the dog. Next, I'm moving on to fussy cutting the stamped images. I'm using my Tim Holtz non-stick scissors, which are really great for cutting fine detail, but if it isn't perfectly cut, it's easy enough to hide. You use any black pen or marker to color right over any of the white showing on the outside of the stamped image. I didn't do that here, but you'll see me do that later in the video. I'm separating the dog from the balloons to alter the size of my stamp because this stamp is just a little bit too tall for the cards I'm making. I wanted this image to be able to move around as much as possible on the card, so making it shorter was important to give him a little bit more room above and below the image. Now notice here that the sky background is this pool color. That's going to be important for this next step and what I'm about to show you. So here I'm using that same color of cardstock that I was just talking about on the sky background, and I'm positioning the balloons and the dog how far I want them to be apart. I'm taking my black pen and I'm just going to draw in these strings. When I draw balloon strings, I like to add little curls and things for fun, and I also like to add a bow either at the base of the balloons or like on the dog's foot, which is what I did in this particular shot. Because I'm using the same pool cardstock that I used for the background, you won't really be able to see this in the final card. However, it will keep the dog and the balloons connected as it moves up and down on the string. After I drew on the strings, I took a pencil and drew kind of where my dog was. When I cut this pool cardstock, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to show from behind the dog when I glued him on. It's always important to keep an open mind when looking at your stamp sets. There are many times where you can try something creative to get your stamp to be taller or shorter, whatever your needs are for your card. This would be a great idea if you wanted to make mini cards for like your kid's lunchbox or something like that. Right before I glued down my stamped dog, I noticed that there were a couple of little spots that needed touching up. So I used my fine tip black marker to color any white areas outside the stamped image where it wasn't cut perfectly. I almost always need to use this technique when I fussy cut. I did mention glossy accents earlier as a visual effect. It gives that glossy look on top. However, it's also a really great and strong adhesive. I use glossy accents to adhere my stamped images to the pool paper. Glossy accents takes just a few seconds to dry, so you can still adjust your paper if it's not quite right in the first try. Here you can see I did have to adjust it a little bit after setting it down. This is the beauty of a wet adhesive. If I used a dry adhesive, it would be permanent right away. Now you can just set that aside to dry and even place an acrylic block on top of it to make sure it stays flat. Now I'll be moving on to my cloud panels. Again, I'm using that same pool cardstock that I used in the last step, and I'm cutting these panels with the stitched rectangle and square dies. These dies leave a stitched edge on the inside and the outside of the cut. I use masking tape to tape these dies down perfectly where I wanted them positioned. I usually like to use washi tape, but masking tape's what I had on my desk. When I use masking tape, I like to remove some of the adhesive just by touching a little bit or sticking it to your shirt a few times. Whenever I remove the masking tape, I just make sure that I go really slow. Sometimes when you remove the masking tape, a little bit of adhesive is left behind. That's okay, you can just use your embossing powder tool. Put the powder on the adhesive, and then you can just rub it right off with your finger. I put a scratch piece of paper under these panels so that I won't get any ink on my work surface. Then I used 3 cloud stamps all over these panels to create the sky background. To make the sky look like it goes beyond the edges of the paper, I made sure to stamp some of the clouds right on the edges, partially off of the panel. This also helps disguise the fact that these are the same 3 clouds over and over. To stamp out the clouds, I used white pigment ink. Pigment ink stays on top of the paper, which makes it look vibrant on nearly any color of cardstock. Just a side note, if you haven't tried ink blending with pigment inks on craft colored cardstock, make that your next experiment. Pigment inks are so awesome and very different from dye inks. If you don't have any pigment inks yet, I would definitely recommend getting started with the white. There are so many awesome techniques you can use out there using just this one ink. As you can see in my clouds, just one stamped image is slightly transparent, which is perfect for the look of these clouds. However, if you wanted your image to be completely opaque, you could let the first layer dry and stamp multiple layers directly on top, allowing the ink to dry between each layer. To make my border frames for the final card, I used this darker blue cardstock. I measured my cardstock at the same size as my card front, which was 4.25 squared, and then a regular A2 card. Then I used that same stitch die from earlier to cut out the middle, creating the frame border. Because this stitch die has the stitch pattern on both sides of the cut, you'll see it in the frame as well as the cloud panel. Here I'm using this frame border just as a guide of where I want to put the cloud panel. I'll put it on the card without adhering it, and then I can put adhesive all over the inside of that frame. Then I can place the cloud panel directly in the middle of that card and lift the frame and it'll be perfectly positioned. Because I used the same die for both pieces, they'll fit together like a puzzle piece. Here I'll take my 3D foam tape and I cut it a little bit thinner just so that it'll be narrower than the border frame that'll go on top of it. I'm going to be making this well so that my shaker elements can go down into the shaker card. These will act like walls, and as long as they're butted up against each other completely, then none of the glitter or sequins will come out. I'll be using Martha Stewart iridescent stars, and they're pretty fine glitter but not super fine. You could use regular glitter here, and as long as you have everything butted up against each other, then nothing should fall out. Alternatively, you could make some more border frames just like we did on the dark blue paper, but use craft foam. Then you could just use adhesive to adhere it down so that it's perfectly shaped like the border. However, I like to use this craft foam tape. The 3D foam tape you can cut to any size and you can lay it down in any shape, which is great for any shaker card, even if it's a heart or any other shape. If you wanted your shaker well to be deeper, you could do 2 layers of foam tape, but because I'm going to be putting so much more dimension on this card with the interactive element, I just wanted to do 1 layer here. If you make the cards too deep, they could be difficult to fit into envelopes, and you definitely would probably have to pay extra postage for one of these dimensional cards. As I mentioned before, you can use pretty much anything for shaker cards. You can use glitter, micro beads, you can use smaller seed beads, confetti, sequins, or even punches or little dies that you cut out. As I mentioned, I'll be using this Martha Stewart iridescent star glitter. It's not a super fine glitter like what we normally think of, but it's bigger, chunkier glitter that's shaped like stars. I'll be pouring it in the middle of the well, and then I shake it out just so that it doesn't form a pile. You want to make sure that it's completely flat before you put your acetate on. I would recommend here, you saw that I shook it out a little bit to bring down that pile because it made a little heap in the center of the well. When I shook it out a little bit to spread out the glitter, I didn't think about it being so close to the edge. So when I removed my release paper, some of the glitter did stick to that adhesive. So I would recommend just keeping it closer to the middle if you can. To make the window for my shaker card, I'm going to use these Duralar transparencies. I just picked these up at Hobby Lobby on a pad in the artist section. They come with these pieces of tissue paper between each of the transparency sheets. I do find it's helpful to use the tissue paper that comes between them to handle these transparencies because it's easy to get fingerprints or dust on them. To add my sentiment, I decided to emboss it right here on this border frame. I'm using my EK Success embossing powder tool before I emboss my sentiment. This tool is essential whenever you are embossing because otherwise the embossing powder likes to stick different places on the paper and you'll leave flecks and it won't be as clean as you'd like. I'm using this smaller sentiment and then I'll stamp a heart on either side. For embossing powder, I like to use this Versamark clear ink. It stays wet for a long time, so you can work with your stamps and figure out what you want to do. You don't have to move particularly quickly. Then I'll use my ultra fine Ranger white embossing powder. I really like this embossing powder because it's for super fine detail, which is great for text or any really detailed images. I like to keep my embossing powder in these little sandwich tubs. I just like to keep the ones that I use the most, and then I'll keep a spoon in there with them so that I can scoop it right over the area that I want to emboss. The reason why I chose to use white embossing powder is because I wanted it to show up really stark white against that dark blue. If I used the white pigment ink, it would be a little bit transparent like I explained earlier. Here I'll just use my heat gun to melt this embossing powder. You do want to make sure that you get your heat gun nice and hot because if you leave it on for too long while it's still warming up, you can warp your paper. Next, I'm going to add another layer of the foam tape. Here's where the interactive element is coming into play. If you remember, I used the clear thread across the card with a threaded bead, which allows the dog to slide back and forth. Because of the thickness of the bead, I need to add this foam tape to the areas I'll be adhering the string. This will allow the bead enough clearance to slide back and forth without stretching out the string, and it'll make sure that it'll move smoothly. I didn't need to match up this foam tape end to end like we did before for the shaker part. However, I was generous because I didn't want the border to sag at all. I just so happened to have these beads on hand, probably from my jewelry making days back in middle school. You could probably use any bead and definitely of any color because you shouldn't be able to see the bead in the final product. I chose to use these beads because they were relatively flat on 2 sides, which made a nice surface for me to glue the dog onto. I used clear jewelry thread, and I cut the string extra long. I'll explain why here in just a minute. I threaded on one of the beads to the thread and held it across the card to decide exactly where I wanted it to go. Once I decided where I wanted it to go across, I removed the adhesive just a little bit. I didn't want to remove all of the release paper because when I was originally doing this, I accidentally dropped the dog onto some exposed adhesive, and when I picked him up, his face came off, so I didn't want that to happen to this one. I held the string taut across the frame and placed it down to the exposed adhesive. Now with such a tiny string, it will not stick very well to this foam tape, but we'll fix this in just a minute. First, I use masking tape to hold the string tight in place. I just taped it down to my work surface. We want to make sure that the string is not sagging whenever it's finally adhered. As I mentioned a second ago, this foam tape wasn't going to be enough by itself to hold the string. So once I got the string positioned on, I put some glossy accents right over top of it, which is a really, really strong adhesive. For the remainder of the card assembly, I left all of this taped down. This will make sure it stays tight while the adhesive dries. This is why I had to cut the string extra long. I wanted to make sure that I had some loose ends to be able to tape it down to my work surface, no problem. I'll cut them off before the end of the card. Now I can remove all of the release paper covering the adhesive tape. Then I'll take my border frame and place it right on top. This just serves to bring together the whole look of the card, and it also hides that foam tape. I really love this part of making a card, when all the pieces are made and it's just down to assembling the final card. So what I'm doing here is adhering a bead of a similar thickness to the original one I used to the top and bottom of the image, so that the entire piece is supported evenly. These do not need to be threaded, however, they just provide support so that the dog doesn't seesaw back and forth. Now's the final step of the card. I'll finish up the card by adding a drop of glossy accents to the top of the moving bead. If you use a smaller bead, you might want to slip some scratch paper under the thread just in case. That way, if you accidentally drip glossy accents, it won't be on your acetate panel. Finally, the card is completely finished. Now this is the hardest part. Make sure you can't see the bead peeking from behind the dog and leave it alone. Do not test it out. Do not play with it at all until the glossy accents is completely dried. Ask me how I know. Alright, so that's the final card for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. So here's a picture of the dog with the shaker behind it, and I also made one without a shaker window, so you don't have to do the shaker part of this card. This was a really fun technique, and I can't stop thinking of the ways I'm going to use it next.